I spent my entire life living for others, for a stepdaughter who never called me mom, and for a world that never saw beyond my simple clothes. I sold my happiness to buy her dreams, but one night, when that same daughter called me a poor woman in front of her wealthy in-laws, I finally broke my silence. What she didn't know in that moment was that the woman she was humiliating was about to change the fate of everyone sitting at that table. My name is Margaret Collins, and I'm 60 years old. I live alone in a quiet part of Seattle, in the same modest house I bought 35 years ago when life still felt full of promise. People often tell me I don't look my age, maybe because I've spent a lifetime wearing grace as my only jewelry. My mornings begin with the sound of coffee brewing and the soft hum of city traffic outside my kitchen window. It's a peaceful silence, the kind that doesn't ask questions but holds every memory like a fragile secret. I've worked for the same logistics company since I was 22. Back then, I was just an intern sorting papers and answering phones. Now, I'm the senior director, overseeing operations across 7 countries. My salary, $70,000 a month, could buy me luxury cars and designer clothes, but I've never been interested in those things. Simplicity became my armor long ago. I wanted people to see me, not what I owned. Especially my stepdaughter, Sophie. When I married Martin Collins, Sophie was 10. A quiet, observant girl with eyes that spoke louder than her words. Her mother had passed away, and I promised Martin I'd take care of her as my own. I tried. I really did. I made her lunch every morning, helped her with school projects, and waited at the gate after class. But no matter how hard I tried, I could feel her resistance, a silent wall between us. To her, I was never mom. Just Margaret. Martin used to say, "Give her time. She'll see your heart one day." But he never got the chance to see it happen. When cancer took him away, Sophie was 17. The day we buried him, she stood at the grave without shedding a single tear. I stood beside her, holding her hand, but she gently pulled it away. That was the day I learned that love, no matter how pure, can't always heal what grief breaks. After Martin's death, Sophie left for college and rarely called. I paid her tuition, her rent, even her medical bills when she broke her arm in sophomore year. She never asked how I managed. Maybe she assumed I worked a small office job, struggling like most women my age. And maybe I let her believe that, because I didn't want her respect to come from money. I wanted it to come from understanding. Years passed. Sophie graduated, got married, and moved into a world far removed from mine. Her husband, Ethan Hayes, came from wealth. Old money, the kind that moves through generations like a quiet crown. I was happy for her, or at least I told myself I was. I sent gifts during holidays, cards on birthdays, and polite messages when she posted photos online. She rarely replied, but I never stopped trying. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness feels like waiting for a door that never opens. Solitude feels like accepting that the door is yours to lock or leave open. I had long chosen solitude. That peace, however, began to shake a little the day my phone rang and Sophie's name appeared on the screen. It had been months since I'd heard her voice. I hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be a mistake. "Hi Margaret," she said, her tone carefully formal. "Ethan's parents are visiting from California next week. They'd love to meet you." The words "they'd love to meet you" felt rehearsed, polite, but hollow. I could hear the nervousness in her voice. Before I could respond, she continued, "We're having dinner at Blue Harbor Grill downtown. It's a really nice place, so maybe wear something simple, okay? Nothing too old-fashioned." For a moment, I said nothing. I looked at the old floral dress hanging by the closet door, the one Martin had once said made me look soft and unbreakable at the same time. I smiled faintly and replied, "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'll be there." Simple as always. After the call ended, I sat by the window, staring at the fading evening light over the city. My reflection looked tired but calm. Sophie's tone had confirmed what I had quietly known for years. She wasn't inviting me because she wanted me there. She was inviting me because it was the polite thing to do. Still, I would go. Not for her approval. Not for their judgment. But for something else. Something I couldn't yet name, but could feel stirring deep inside me. a quiet storm waiting for its night. The week passed quietly, though something about that phone call lingered in my mind like a half-remembered dream. I told myself not to overthink it, that Sophie was finally trying to bridge the distance between us. But I knew my daughter, or rather my stepdaughter, well enough to hear what she didn't say. The tremor in her voice, the hesitation before every polite word. It wasn't affection. It was image management. She didn't want a mother that looked poor sitting at her wealthy husband's family table. She wanted to avoid embarrassment. Still, I wanted to believe her intentions were genuine. That maybe, after all these years, she just wanted to reconnect. So, I spent the following evenings preparing small gestures that might make her happy. A jar of homemade marmalade, a delicate silk scarf I had once bought for her in Portland but never gave. I wrapped them neatly and placed them in my old brown handbag, the same one I'd carried since Martin's days. 2 days before the dinner, Sophie called again. Her voice was smoother this time, practiced. "Hey, Margaret. Just wanted to remind you, Friday, 7 o'clock sharp, Blue Harbor Grill. Ethan's parents are really looking forward to meeting you." "That's lovely," I said softly. "Should I bring anything?" There was a brief silence on the line, the kind where you can almost hear someone roll their eyes. Then she said, "Oh no. It's fine. Just be yourself. And maybe don't mention work or anything about, the company. They're not really into business talk." I smiled faintly. "Don't worry. I'll be the quiet one at the table." She laughed nervously. "Perfect." Then, after a pause, added, "Oh, and Mom, sorry Margaret, if they ask, you can just say you used to work in accounting or something simple. They're very traditional. They might not understand women in big positions." That last line hit me differently. Not because of what she said, but because of how easily she said it. She wasn't protecting me. She was hiding me. I didn't respond for a few seconds. My hand rested on the receiver, and I could almost feel Martin's voice echoing in the back of my mind. "She'll see your heart one day." Maybe she would. But not that day. "I understand," I finally said. "Accounting sounds simple enough." "Thank you," she sighed in relief. "You're the best." After the call ended, I stayed seated for a while, staring at the floor. The afternoon light cut through the blinds in narrow golden stripes. Dust floated like tiny ghosts in the air. My office desk sat by the window, covered in reports, emails, and proposals from 6 different countries. I was scheduled to review a merger that weekend worth $40 million. And yet, my own stepdaughter wanted me to pretend I balanced checkbooks for a living. The irony was almost poetic. That evening, I took a long walk through the streets of Seattle. The air was crisp, tinged with the smell of rain. Couples laughed in the distance, lights flickered in coffee shops, and life moved around me as if nothing were wrong. But inside, I felt a quiet ache. Not anger, just the dull pain of invisibility. To the world, I was powerful. To my daughter, I was small. When I returned home, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the small box of memories I kept hidden behind the pantry. Inside were old photos, Martin smiling by the lake, Sophie with her first school trophy, and a picture of all 3 of us from a long-forgotten summer picnic. My hand trembled slightly as I held it. Sophie had been 11, wearing a yellow dress and an expression that looked somewhere between joy and suspicion. I remembered that day clearly, how she had accidentally called me Mom for the first time, then blushed and corrected herself. I never reminded her of it again. The next morning at work, Olivia, my assistant, noticed my distracted state. "Rough week?" she asked, handing me a stack of reports. "Not rough," I said. "Just reflective." "You've been reflective a lot lately," she said with a gentle smile. "Something to do with family?" I looked at her and smiled faintly. "Isn't it always?" By Friday afternoon, the city was washed in golden light, and the air felt heavier than usual. I stood before the mirror in my room, adjusting my old beige dress. It was plain but clean, pressed to perfection. I didn't bother with jewelry, except for the wedding ring I still wore out of habit. I tied my hair back loosely and looked at myself for a long time. "You're fine just like this," I whispered. "You've faced boardrooms full of men twice your age and twice your ego. You can handle one dinner." Before leaving, I opened my drawer and looked at my black American Express card. The silver letters glinted under the lamp's light. For a moment, I thought of leaving it behind, then slipped it quietly into my purse. Not because I intended to use it, but because I had a feeling that night might not go the way Sophie expected. Friday arrived faster than I expected, and yet time seemed to move in slow motion that day. By late afternoon, Seattle's skyline had turned gold under the setting sun. The faint hum of traffic drifted through my open window as I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the small silver earrings Martin had given me on our first anniversary. My reflection showed an old woman trying to appear calm, but there was a storm somewhere behind her eyes. I checked my purse one last time, wallet, phone, the small gift for Sophie, and my black American Express card tucked quietly inside. Not for show, but for assurance. Life had taught me that power doesn't always roar, sometimes it waits patiently in silence. At 6:30, I locked my door and stepped outside. The evening breeze carried a touch of autumn, cool enough to sting but gentle enough to remind me I was still alive. The cab ride to the Blue Harbor Grill was quiet. I watched the city lights flicker across the car window like scattered memories, each one a moment of giving, forgiving, or being forgotten. When I arrived, the restaurant glowed like a palace of glass and steel. Inside, chandeliers glimmered above perfectly dressed people who looked like they belonged in glossy magazines. The hostess smiled politely, though I noticed her eyes flick briefly toward my simple beige dress before she asked, "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," I said. "Under Hayes." Her posture straightened immediately. "Of course, right this way, ma'am." As she led me through the crowded dining room, I could feel glances brushing against me, people noticing, judging, dismissing. It wasn't the first time. The weight of perception was something I'd carried all my life, but that night, it pressed heavier than usual. At a corner table near the window sat Sophie, her husband Ethan, and his parents, Robert and Linda Hayes. They looked like a picture of success, flawless smiles, polished jewelry, and a sense of entitlement that filled the space around them. Sophie spotted me and waved, a little too quickly, a little too forced. "Margaret," she said with that same polite brightness people use with strangers they don't want to offend. "You made it." I smiled softly. I said I would. As I reached the table, Ethan stood just long enough to greet me, his handshake light and distant. "Good to finally meet you," he said, already turning back to his seat. His parents didn't rise at all. Robert Hayes gave me a practiced smile. "So nice of you to join us, Margaret. Sophie's told us so much about you." I took the empty chair beside Sophie and folded my hands in my lap. "All good things, I hope." Linda chuckled. "Of course. She says you're a simple woman with simple tastes. That's refreshing." The word simple lingered in the air like smoke. I let it pass with a quiet nod. Sophie shifted slightly in her chair, pretending to adjust her napkin. The waiter arrived to take our orders, and everyone chose dishes with names I could barely pronounce. When the waiter looked to me, I simply said, "Just the salmon, please. And water." Linda smiled thinly. "Oh, that's modest. Most people go for the wine pairing here. It's divine." "I'm not most people," I said gently. "I like to stay clear-headed." Ethan laughed under his breath, as if I'd said something naive. I noticed Sophie shoot him a warning glance, then turned to me quickly. "So, Margaret, how's work? You still doing the accounting thing?" I looked at her for a long moment, the faintest trace of irony touching my lips. "Yes, dear. Still doing the accounting thing." Robert leaned forward, swirling his wine. "That's admirable. It must be tough making ends meet these days, especially at your age." I smiled softly. "It's not as hard as people think." There was a flicker of awkward silence, and Sophie quickly filled it with talk about her new house, Ethan's promotion, and their upcoming vacation to Europe. I listened quietly, nodding in the right places, my mind drifting between her words and the memory of the little girl who once cried because she'd lost her favorite toy, and how I had searched for it until dawn just to see her smile again. Now that same girl couldn't even look me in the eye. The evening stretched on. Every compliment they gave was wrapped in condescension, every smile was lined with pity. I could feel it, The way Linda's eyes measured my old purse, the way Robert's glance fell on my worn shoes. When dessert arrived, Robert raised his glass. "To family," he said cheerfully, looking at his wife, his son, and then Sophie. His gaze never once reached me. I lifted my glass of water anyway. "To family," I whispered. As they talked about luxury cars and beach homes, I quietly folded the small scarf I'd brought for Sophie and placed it on the table beside her. "I brought you something," I said. She looked at it, hesitant, then smiled faintly. "Oh, thank you, Margaret. You didn't have to." "I know," I said softly. "But I wanted to." She didn't open it. Somewhere inside me, something began to shift, a quiet, slow unraveling of restraint. The woman who had spent decades staying silent was beginning to wake up. The waiter cleared the plates, and for a brief moment, the table fell into a rare silence. The hum of the restaurant surrounded us, soft jazz, clinking glasses, laughter from nearby tables. But at ours, there was only a quiet tension disguised as politeness. Sophie's husband leaned back in his chair, his arm resting behind her casually, like a man entirely comfortable in his world. His parents sat poised, every movement deliberate, every smile calculated. Linda Hayes broke the silence first. "So, Margaret," she began, swirling her wine. "Sophie tells us you've had quite a steady life." I smiled faintly. "You could say that." She tilted her head, pretending interest. "And you're still working at, what was it again, dear?" She looked at Sophie for confirmation. Sophie's voice was thin. "Accounting. A small office downtown." I felt my lips twitch, not in irritation but amusement. The irony of it all, how my stepdaughter had shrunk my world to fit her comfort. "Yes," I said, still calm. "A small office downtown." Robert chuckled lightly, leaning forward on his elbows. "I admire that. Most people your age would have retired by now, but I suppose it's good to keep busy, especially when you don't have other obligations." His tone was mild, but I could hear the edge beneath it. The assumption that I was alone because I hadn't achieved enough to be surrounded by people. I nodded slowly. "Keeping busy keeps the heart from rusting." He smirked. "I'll drink to that." Ethan laughed softly, and I saw Sophie's shoulders stiffen. She forced a smile and said quickly, "You know, Margaret's always been very disciplined. She believes in earning everything the hard way." Linda raised a brow. "Oh, that's rare these days. I guess that's why you live so modestly." "It's charming, really." Modestly. Charming. Those words had always been society's polite way of saying less than us. I sipped my water, feeling the sting of humiliation settle somewhere deep in my chest. I had faced ruthless executives, corporate takeovers, and boardroom betrayals, but nothing quite hurt like being looked at with pity by people who didn't know the first thing about dignity. Sophie's laughter suddenly pierced the silence, a nervous, too bright sound. "Mom's always been like that," she said, her voice wobbling on the word mom. "She hates wasting money. Even when I was in college, she'd send these small care packages. Homemade stuff. I guess she preferred that over, store-bought things." The table chuckled politely. I smiled, though it wasn't amusement that curved my lips, it was control. "Yes," I said. "Homemade things have heart. Store-bought ones just have price tags." The smile faded from Ethan's face, and for the first time that evening, Linda looked faintly uncomfortable. But the moment didn't last. Dessert arrived, lavish slices of chocolate soufflé, gold-dusted berries, and coffee served in porcelain cups. As the waiter poured, Robert reached into his jacket and pulled out his wallet. "Please allow me," he said grandly. "It's only right that I take care of dinner." Before I could respond, Ethan added with a smirk, "Oh, don't argue, Margaret. Dad insists on paying. You know how he is about generosity." Their laughter followed, light but sharp. I glanced at Sophie. Her eyes were downcast, her fork trembling slightly as she cut into her dessert. I knew she wasn't cruel by nature. She was afraid of losing face in front of people whose approval meant nothing. Robert handed his gold card to the waiter with a smile. The young man took it politely and disappeared toward the counter. But when he returned a few minutes later, his face had changed. He leaned down and whispered something to Robert. Robert frowned. "That's ridiculous. Try it again." The waiter nodded and left, but I could already sense it, the shift in the air. Sophie's face tightened, Ethan straightened, and Linda adjusted her pearls. A minute later, the waiter returned once more, this time speaking quietly but clearly. "I'm sorry, sir. The transaction isn't going through. Do you have another form of payment?" Robert's jaw clenched. "That's impossible. This is a gold account." Linda turned toward her husband. "Robert, just use the backup card." He fumbled through his wallet and handed another one over. The waiter walked off again, and silence thickened around the table like smoke. Sophie's face had gone pale. Ethan muttered something under his breath. When the waiter returned again, the look on his face said it all. "I'm sorry, sir. That one's declined as well." Linda's cheeks flushed pink. Robert slammed the card down on the table. "It must be a system error," he snapped. Sophie whispered, "Maybe they've frozen the account for travel?" I sat quietly, watching them unravel. For years, I had watched people in power crumble when the mask slipped. But this was different. This was personal. And then, just when I thought the humiliation had reached its peak, Robert turned toward me with an awkward smile that barely hid his discomfort. "Margaret, perhaps you could cover this for now? Just until we sort it out. I'll reimburse you, of course." Sophie's lips parted in shock. "Dad." But before she could say another word, I reached for my purse slowly. My hand didn't tremble, my heartbeat didn't rise. The storm inside me had gone still. This was the moment, the one that life had been quietly leading me toward for years. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut through marble. Even the jazz playing in the background seemed to fade. I could feel Sophie's embarrassment, Ethan's frustration, Linda's forced composure. Robert was trying to laugh it off, but his hand trembled slightly as he tapped his fingers against the tablecloth. I reached for my purse, slowly, deliberately. "Of course, Robert," I said softly. "I'll take care of it." Sophie looked mortified. "Mom, Margaret, you don't have to." But Robert interrupted, eager to regain control. No, it's just a temporary issue. I appreciate the gesture." I nodded and gently unzipped my bag. Every movement felt heavy with years of swallowed pride and quiet restraint. My fingers brushed against the soft fabric lining before they found the smooth, metallic edge of my black card. I looked at it for a moment, not out of hesitation but reflection. This wasn't about the money. It was about something far older, dignity. I closed the bag again and instead looked up at Robert. "Actually," I said quietly, "I think it would be better if the restaurant just splits the check. It's only fair." Ethan laughed under his breath. "Fair? Margaret, this dinner easily costs more than—" He stopped mid-sentence, catching Sophie's warning glare. Linda smiled stiffly. "Oh dear, please don't worry about the amount. It's just dinner." I tilted my head slightly. "Yes," I said. "Just dinner." The waiter returned, still holding the bill politely between his fingers. The tension was a living thing now, creeping through every inch of that table. Robert avoided my eyes. Sophie bit her lip. And then, as if the universe wanted to underline the cruelty of that moment, Robert sighed and said, "Margaret, maybe you should take this." He slid the bill toward me. "You probably know how to handle smaller expenses better than I do." Sophie's eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad." But Robert continued, oblivious. "I mean, you've lived simply all your life, haven't you? I'm sure you're used to stretching every dollar." My hands stayed perfectly still. Inside, something in me broke, but not the way they expected. Not with tears or anger. With clarity. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate. Then I smiled, a slow, patient smile. "You're right," I said. "I do know how to stretch a dollar. I know how to stretch one into 1,000 when it's earned with integrity." The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy. Linda cleared her throat, pretending to adjust her bracelet. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Sophie's eyes were glassy, but she said nothing. Robert forced a chuckle. "Well, That's quite the attitude, Margaret. I leaned back slightly. No, Robert. That's quite the experience. The waiter stood awkwardly by, unsure whether to leave or stay. I finally reached for my purse again, this time without hesitation. My hand found the black card once more, and I held it between my fingers for a long second, the soft lighting glinting off its edge. When I looked up, Sophie's eyes met mine, and in that moment, I saw her confusion. She didn't yet know what I was holding, but something in my expression must have told her this wasn't about dinner anymore. Here, I said calmly, handing the card to the waiter. Please, take care of the bill. Robert opened his mouth to protest. No, really, that's not. But the waiter had already glanced at the card, and froze. His posture shifted instantly. Of course, Mrs. Collins, he said, his tone now respectful, even nervous. Right away. He walked briskly toward the counter, whispering something to the restaurant manager, who looked up suddenly with recognition. What's going on? Linda asked, her voice uneasy. I smiled faintly. Just giving you a small lesson in fairness. A moment later, the restaurant manager himself appeared at our table. Mrs. Collins, he said warmly. We didn't realize you were dining with us tonight. You never need to pay here. You're one of our principal investors. Please, allow me to handle everything personally. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan blinked in disbelief. Robert stared as if he'd been struck. I turned to face them all, my voice calm, almost gentle. You thought I was poor because I live simply. You assumed silence meant weakness. But you forgot, silence also means control. I just prefer using it wisely. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft clink of the waiter setting down the paid receipt beside me. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back with quiet grace. You wanted to pay for my dignity with $400, I said, meeting Robert's eyes. Tonight, I'm paying for your lesson instead. And then I turned to Sophie. Her lips trembled, her eyes wet. Mom, she whispered, barely audible. For the first time in years, that word didn't hurt, it healed. The moment hung suspended in the air like a fragile thread between shame and awakening. Sophie's voice broke the silence again, quieter this time, trembling. Mom, I didn't know. I looked at her gently. No, you didn't. And that's all right, Sophie. You were never supposed to know how much I earned or what I owned. I only ever wanted you to know who I was. Her eyes shimmered as she lowered her gaze. Ethan stared down at his plate, his jaw tight with embarrassment. Linda's cheeks were pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Robert, the man who just minutes ago had offered me charity, now couldn't look at me at all. The restaurant manager smiled politely and stepped back to give us privacy, though I noticed other tables beginning to glance our way. I could feel it, the subtle shift of attention, the realization that the poor woman at the corner table wasn't who she seemed to be. I stood straight, my voice steady and calm. You know, it's funny, I said softly, how the world measures people by how loud their wealth sounds. But real power doesn't make noise, it's quiet. It's the hand that builds, not the one that brags. I reached into my bag once more, taking out a sleek leather folder with my company's insignia embossed on it. I placed it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside were neatly stacked documents and glossy reports bearing my signature. I oversee operations for Collins Global Logistics, I explained, my tone even. We manage 7 international branches, one of which handles this very restaurant's import shipments. Ethan looked up sharply, his face drained of color. You're that Collins? I smiled faintly. The quiet one, yes. Linda exhaled, her hand trembling around her wine glass. Oh my God, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Robert finally spoke, his tone brittle. Mrs. Collins, I didn't realize. I held up a hand to stop him. You didn't need to. That's the whole point, isn't it? You shouldn't have to realize a person's worth through their money. Sophie covered her face with her hands. I'm so sorry, she said through tears. I lied to them. I told them you worked in accounting because I didn't want them to judge you. I didn't want them to look down on me. My voice softened. So you lied to protect your pride, but not to protect my heart. She looked up, her tears spilling freely now. I didn't mean to hurt you. I know, I said quietly. But you did. Every time you tried to hide me, you taught them I was something to be ashamed of. And that, Sophie, is worse than any insult. Ethan shifted in his seat, his discomfort plain. We never meant. I turned toward him calmly. You never meant to, but you still did. You looked at me and saw someone small because my clothes weren't expensive, because my life didn't glitter. But I've learned something over 60 years of living, Ethan. Gold doesn't shine brighter than decency. He dropped his gaze, speechless. I took a deep breath and looked around the table one last time. You see, I continued, I chose to live simply because I wanted Sophie to grow with empathy, not entitlement. I thought if she saw me live humbly, she'd learn to value people over things. But I realize now, you can't teach humility to those who mistake silence for weakness. Sophie's voice cracked again. Mom, please, stop. You're right. I know you're right. I didn't know how to make them see you the way I do. I smiled sadly. The way you thought you saw me, you mean? Her tears came harder, her shoulders trembling. For a moment, I wanted to reach out and hold her, to tell her it was all forgiven. But no, this was the moment she needed to sit with what she had done. Linda finally whispered, Mrs. Collins, I can't imagine how humiliating this must have been. I interrupted her softly, still calm. Humiliation only hurts when you believe the other person's judgment matters. Tonight, you've given me the gift of remembering it doesn't. The table fell silent again. I reached for my glass of water, took a sip, and then said, You offered me $400 to stay away. But tonight, you've given me something far more valuable, clarity. I finally know that silence can protect dignity, but sometimes it must break to reveal truth. No one spoke. The sound of dishes clinking in the distance filled the room like a slow, steady rhythm. I placed the leather folder back into my purse, zipped it closed, and looked at Sophie one last time. You always said you were afraid people would judge you for where you came from, I said softly. But the truth, my dear, is that I was afraid they'd judge me for what I raised you to become. Sophie covered her mouth and began to sob. Ethan looked away. Robert and Linda sat frozen, their eyes on the table. I pushed my chair back and stood. I think that's enough dinner for tonight, I said quietly. The check is taken care of. You can all go back to your world now, polished, perfect, and painfully hollow. As I walked toward the door, the restaurant manager nodded respectfully and opened it for me. The night air outside was cold, crisp, and freeing. The city lights shimmered in the distance like constellations scattered across the earth. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Not because I had revealed my wealth, but because I had finally stopped hiding my worth. The air outside felt cleaner, sharper, as though the night itself had been waiting for me to step into it. My footsteps echoed softly against the pavement, and with every one, I felt the weight of years lifting off my shoulders. I had spent decades carrying the burden of being misunderstood, but now, there was peace in finally being seen, even if it came through confrontation. By the time I reached home, the silence inside my house felt different. It wasn't the same emptiness that used to linger after unanswered phone calls or forgotten holidays. It was calm, pure, almost sacred. I placed my purse on the counter and sat in my favorite chair near the window, where the city lights painted the room in flickers of gold and blue. For a long time, I didn't move. I just breathed. And for the first time in a very long while, that was enough. The next morning, the doorbell rang. I wasn't surprised. Some things you can feel before they happen. When I opened the door, Sophie was standing there, her eyes swollen, her face pale from sleeplessness. In her hands, she held the small scarf I had given her at dinner, the one she never opened. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I stepped aside without a word. She walked into the living room like someone entering a church, hesitant, remorseful. I watched her for a moment as she looked around the house, noticing the small details she had ignored before, the neatly stacked books, the framed photo of Martin on the mantel, the certificates on the wall she'd never asked about. She turned toward me slowly. "I couldn't sleep last night," she said. "Every time I closed my eyes, I saw your face at that table. I saw what I did to you. I nodded, letting her speak. She clutched the scarf tightly in her hands. You didn't deserve that. Any of it. You gave me everything. A home, education, love, and I treated you like a stranger. No, worse than that. Like an inconvenience. Her voice broke. I've been so stupid, Mom. The word mom lingered in the air like a melody I hadn't heard in years. My chest tightened, not with pain, but with something softer, an ache laced with forgiveness. I sat down and motioned for her to do the same. She hesitated, then sat across from me, her eyes red and searching. Sophie, I began softly, I didn't want you to see last night as revenge. I wanted you to understand that dignity doesn't need to be defended, it only needs to be recognized. I hid my success not to shame you, but because I wanted you to learn to respect people without knowing what they own. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I understand now. You were never poor, but I was. Not in money, but in heart. Her words hung in the air, fragile and true. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she reached out slowly and took my hands in hers. I can't undo what I did, she whispered, but I want to start over, if you'll let me. I looked at her fingers gripping mine, the same hands I had once held when teaching her to write, to paint, to hold a spoon. The same hands that had pulled away at her father's funeral. Now they trembled with regret. I squeezed them gently. Starting over isn't about forgetting, I said. It's about remembering differently. Sophie leaned forward and pressed her forehead against my hands. Her shoulders shook as she cried quietly, the kind of crying that comes when pride finally collapses under truth. I let her. Sometimes silence is the only language that forgiveness understands. After a while, she looked up. Ethan wants to apologize too. He was ashamed last night. I gave a faint smile. Good. A little shame can build better men. That earned the first small laugh from her, broken but real. She stood and walked to the mantel, looking at Martin's photo. He'd be proud of you, she said softly. I joined her. Maybe. But I think he'd be prouder of you for being here right now. Sophie turned to me, eyes wet again. Do you forgive me? I met her gaze steadily. I never stopped loving you. Forgiveness comes with that. We stood there in silence for a while, two women bound not by blood, but by something stronger, understanding. Before leaving, she placed the scarf carefully on the table. I opened it this morning, she said. It's beautiful. I'll wear it the next time we have dinner. But only if you'll come. I will, I said. This time as myself. Sophie smiled weakly, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. Then she turned and left. When the door closed behind her, I looked around my quiet home and whispered to the still air, maybe this is what healing sounds like. Silence but not empty anymore. That night, the world outside my window looked softer than usual. The lights of Seattle shimmered over the bay like 1,000 gentle apologies, and for the first time in years, I felt like the silence inside my home wasn't loneliness, it was peace. I sat by my window with a cup of tea, the kind Martin used to make, and let the memories come and go like the tide. There was no bitterness left in me now, only understanding. I thought of Sophie, of the little girl who once hid behind her father's legs when I first moved into their home. The one who refused to call me Mom, but still left her drawings on my pillow. The one who would one day grow up to mistake humility for weakness. It hurt to see what she became, but it healed me to see who she was becoming again. The next morning, my phone buzzed. A message from Sophie. It was a photo, her sitting at breakfast, wearing the scarf I had given her, smiling softly into the camera. Underneath, she'd written, dinner next week. Just you and me. I stared at the screen for a long time, smiling through quiet tears. It wasn't an apology written in words, it was a promise in its own way. I walked over to my desk and pulled out my leather-bound diary, the one I had filled with years of unsent letters and unfinished thoughts. I opened to a fresh page and began to write. My handwriting trembled a little, but every word felt lighter than the last. I've lived long enough to know that love isn't measured by how loudly it's declared, but by how long it survives in silence. I once thought silence made me invisible. Now I know, it made me strong. I paused, looking at the photograph on my desk, Martin's kind smile, Sophie's awkward teenage grin, and my own younger face, hopeful and uncertain. Time had changed everything, but somehow the essence of that moment, the fragile thread between love and forgiveness, had endured. I continued writing. Last night wasn't about proving I was rich. It was about proving I was never poor. My wealth was never in my salary, my position, or my investments. It was in my endurance, my grace, and my refusal to let cruelty define me. I spent years living quietly, not because I was weak, but because I wanted my silence to be worth something when it finally spoke. When I finished, I set the pen down and closed the diary. The sound of it shutting felt final, like the closing of a long, painful chapter. I walked toward the mirror by the hallway and studied my reflection. The lines on my face had deepened, but so had the calm in my eyes. "You did well, Margaret," I whispered to myself. "You didn't raise her by blood, but you raised her by example." Later that evening, I stepped out to the garden behind my house. The air was crisp, the sky washed in deep indigo. I could still hear faint laughter from a nearby home, a family sharing dinner perhaps. I smiled at the sound. I sat on the wooden bench Martin had built years ago and watched the stars begin to appear, one by one. My hands rested in my lap, still and steady. The pain that once lived in them had turned into something gentler, wisdom. And in that quiet moment, I finally said aloud what my heart had been whispering since that dinner. I told them all that wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in the heart. The wind rustled softly through the trees as if agreeing with me. Somewhere inside, I knew that I had closed the circle of my life exactly the way I was meant to, without revenge, without resentment, and without regret. Because peace, I realized, is not something you find. It's something you earn when you finally understand your own worth. And as the stars shimmered above me, I closed my eyes, smiled, and whispered to the night, "Now, I can rest." Before I end my story tonight, I just want to thank you for listening to a piece of my life, a story about silence, dignity, and rediscovering self-worth. If my journey touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and share this story with someone who still believes kindness is weakness. And tell me before you go, if you were in my place that night, sitting at that table, what would you have done? I'll be waiting to read your answer in the comments.